great pleasure this evening to welcome our lecturer, Peter Yeoman. Peter is an archaeologist, historian, author. He has been head of cultural heritage and principal heritage researcher at Historic Scotland. And tonight he's going to be talking to us about Kilmartin and Iona, sacred landscapes of ritual and worship. And Peter will be running a tour for ASA next year about the Scottish Highlands. You can see from the picture there just what is included. So it sounds like an absolutely gorgeous tour, all that marvellous Scottish scenery and history. So I'm sure we are in for a real treat tonight. Welcome, Peter, and thank you so much for doing the Travel Tuesday lecture for ASA.
Thank you very much, Susanna. Hello, everybody. Hello from Edinburgh. It's a great pleasure to be with you and to be giving this talk. I'm an archaeologist. I've had a 50-year career in archaeology, and quite a few of the places that will feature in this tour are places that I've had various connections with, some very, very close connections with during my work in the last few decades. And when Julia first sent me the outline itinerary for this tour, my immediate reaction was, wow, this is just, such a superb selection of places, how we can make it all fit in together to get a really good understanding of lots of different aspects of Scottish heritage, Scottish history, Scottish archaeology, and above all, of the people who have shaped all of this, both in the recent past and in the ancient past as well. So I'll be kind of comparing and contrasting two of the most sacred landscapes in Scotland, really quite geographically close to each other, both in the wonderful county of Argyll. So that's the area. If you took a line kind of through Edinburgh, through Glasgow, carried on to the Southern Hebrides, the Inner Hebrides, you would hit on the mainland, you'd hit Argyll, and then out a little bit in the sea, you would hit the beautiful little island of Iona, which you have to travel across Mull to get to. That's Mull, a wonderful glaciated landscape of Mull in the background of this image. What I do now in semi-retirement is lead tours in the Mediterranean, but particularly in Scotland, and I'm just back from leading another tour to the wonderful island of Orkney and focusing on the amazing prehistory there. And I also carry on doing research, including research for Historic Scotland and various bits of writing and lecturing. This is the marks here, give you an idea of the sort of circle that the tour is going to encompass, starting in Glasgow in the west, then going further west into Argyll and over to Iona, where it says Inner Hebrides there on the left-hand side, and then up the Great Glen, through Glencoe, up to Inverness, around the northeast of Scotland, some wonderful historic gardens and castles up there. Back down the east coast, St Andrews, ending up in Edinburgh, which will be handy for me because that's where I live. And here's just a small selection of some of the places: the wonderful Kelvin Grove Museum, a great civic museum in Glasgow, one of the last of the great Victorian museums created in the British Isles, 1901, with amazing collections of both natural history, Egyptology, but also an amazing collection of Scottish art and archaeology as well in there. Dumfries House, a great Palladian house of the mid-1700s, rescued in the 1990s by Prince Charles, now King Charles, who took a very close interest, and it's now part of his foundation, actually. And it is quite remarkable what he's done with the house and with its incredible collection of Chippendale furniture. Duart Castle on Mull, you sail past that, and would take a little ferry from the travel hub town of Oban, which is just to the north of Kilmartin, which I'll be talking about. The castle of the Clan Macleans, supporters of the Lords of the Isles through the 1400s, 1500s particularly. Lords of the Isles, of course, all buried at Iona. The spectacular landscape of Glencoe, with its terribly sad event, 13th of February 1692, the massacre of Glencoe, murdered by government soldiers who they'd previously welcomed into their homes. It's all part of the Jacobites story. Going then up into more into the Northwest Highlands, beautiful gardens at Inverurie, National Trust for Scotland property, Lochside Gardens, which were created from a barren wilderness with very, very rare plants there. The lovely private home of the royal family at Balmoral, you don't get to see much of the house there. You get to see some of it. You don't get into the private apartments, but the gardens and the grounds are absolutely spectacular in what's called Royal Deeside on the lovely River Dee. And this, of course, is Scottish baronial architecture, which was, to a certain extent, we can thank Queen Victoria and Prince Albert, who bought Balmoral around about 1850, and on the basis of that reinvented the Scottish Highlands in popular imagination and with tourism as well. Crathis Castle down there and lovely gardens and other fine 16th century castles, absolutely wonderful National Trust gardens. And a little excursion to the Isle of May, which has 1,000 years of monasticism on it. It's a bit of a twin to Iona. It's in the east coast at the mouth of the Firth of Forth, only 40 miles from where I'm sitting here just now in Edinburgh, but it's a national nature reserve, and when our tour visits, it will be peak puffin, about 40,000 breeding pairs of puffins on the Isle of May. So we'll have the bird life, total quarter of a million breeding seabirds there, but also an amazing human story with the archaeology. Stirling Castle, described as the place, the brooch which clasps together the highlands and the lowlands. Royal Castle, and fantastic castle to visit. There's more of the medieval royal castle there than there is at Edinburgh, although Edinburgh is pretty amazing as well. But in my own personal connection with that has been about 15 years ago when we recreated the interiors of the palace of James V and his French wife Mary of Guise from about 1540. You probably don't know much about them, except that they are the parents of Mary Queen of Scots. But we brought them out of obscurity with the recreation of the interiors of their palace, which was an amazing project to work on and allowed me to meet with Her Majesty the Queen, our late Queen Elizabeth II, in one of the recreated royal interiors there. Incidentally, I also met Prince Philip, the Duke of Edinburgh, in that, who has a certain reputation for gaffes, for foot in mouth. Now, sadly, of course, also died. But it was a real pleasure. And when I was introduced by our chief executive of Historic Scotland, she, of course, used my title then, which was Head of Cultural Heritage. And immediately, Prince Philip, Duke of Edinburgh, leaned closely into me. So she said, "This is Peter Yeoman, Head of Cultural Heritage." And he leaned into me and said, "What the bloody hell does that mean?" Which was actually brilliant because it was a conversation opener and put me at ease. We all laughed, and I was able to tell him that I was responsible for the archaeology and knowledge and understanding of the 350 properties in care. That's the Historic Scotland's estate heritage, and with 350 properties in care. So from all the stone circles, the monasteries, the churches, the castles, and so on. And of course, Edinburgh Castle, which I've had a 40-year engagement with. It's still going on to this day. I'm currently engaged in a piece of research on the 1617 palace of James VI inside the castle, something that's been kind of overlooked and lost to a certain extent. So that's just by way of an introduction, a little bit about me and a little bit about the tour as well. So on to our main subject. Kilmartin and Iona, sacred landscapes of ritual and worship from prehistory and early Christianity. So what I'm going to do here as archaeologists, we can only work with what we have. Unfortunately, these are both places that have been subject to considerable research and investigation over the last generation or so. So we can say quite a lot about them. And in both places, the remains that we have to work with represent the sort of higher lives of people of the past. Obviously, in the case of Iona, we're dealing with Christianity and its introduction, the arrival of Columba, St Columba there in 563, very early in the story of Christianity in Britain. Meanwhile, by complete contrast, at Kilmartin, we have the stone circles, the stone alignments, the rock art, and the burial places of generations of people from the Neolithic and Bronze Age, so going back more than about 5,500 years. We don't have many of the places that they lived or the fields that they ploughed to produce their food or the pastures where they kept their animals. But of course, the entire landscape of the amazing valley of Kilmartin is just absolutely full. I mean, it's one of the richest places in Europe for experiencing prehistoric archaeology in all its forms. And what it's very helpful for is helping us understand maybe what they thought about themselves and how they express themselves in their higher life. And this is typical of traditional societies that after they've existed for 200, 300 years, these were incoming farmers. These areas, the whole of Britain was settled from the continent by incoming farmers over many generations, moving gradually northwards and getting into areas like this in Argyll, and supplanting pre-existing, very, very small pre-existing populations of hunter-gatherers of what we call the Mesolithic period. So settled farming, that was a huge revolution. But then again, you've got to put it in context. Our species have been hunter-gatherers for about 500,000 years. And in Britain, we've been farmers for 6,000 years. So you put it into context in that way. But all of these traditional societies, what seems to happen after they become established, after a period of time, they start to express their belief system, if you like, in stone, or in the case of Scotland, in stone, because that's what they had to work with. And it's from these glimpses through their monuments that they've left behind that we can start to understand something of, all of these societies that will have foundation myths. They are thinking about an afterlife, and they're thinking about how they can control and influence what they thought were aspects of their everyday lives which were controlled by the supernatural, and how they could take certain actions to ensure that their world maybe stayed in equilibrium and that the crops kept growing and the animals kept reproducing and they kept having food to live on, because they had times which were very, very difficult indeed. There's just a quick map of the valley, which is just so full and so close to the sea as well. That's Mull and Iona are just kind of off to top left of that image, and Oban, where we stay on this tour, is only about 25 miles to the north of this, really quite close. And it's an extraordinarily rich landscape to walk through. And with sites so close together, it allows you to walk through it and to experience this. But we're talking about quite a long span of time. You've got stone circles there that probably originate from about 3,500 BC in the Neolithic, through to a line of what's called a linear cairn cemetery. So this is a line you can see some of them there, a line of tombs which only date from the Bronze Age, about 1,500 BC. So long periods of time in which society changed. And of course, one of the biggest changes, very much at the forefront of our minds, was climate change. That the Neolithic, the climate was slightly kinder than it is now. And through the Bronze Age, and certainly by this time around about 1,500 BC, the climate had deteriorated quite a lot. It had become wetter, particularly stormier, And one of the results of this was the growth of blanket peat bog, which took away what had been previously productive land in the Neolithic. So Neolithic farms and fields are now underneath areas of peat. And there's an image of the linear cemetery from the Bronze Age with these burial cairns. And a lot of these have been excavated, but sadly, a lot of them were excavated, hacked into in the Victorian period by landowners looking for treasure, presumably. So actually, we lost a hell of a lot of information and archaeology in these very unsophisticated attempts some time ago. And this is very close to a magnificent new museum, the Kilmartin Glen Museum. Absolutely brilliant. The old museum, which was very good from about 2000, closed recently for a number of years. They managed to raise the few £1 million that they needed, and they've created a spectacular. It was in the running for UK Museum of the Year when it reopened a couple of years ago, and obviously a visit there is part of this tour. It's one of the best museums in Europe, actually. There's the stone circle. There's actually two stone circles at this place, maybe around about 3000 BC. And we don't really know what these places were used for, although the process of creating them was also probably something that was very, very important over quite a long period of time. And interestingly, one of the things that we've been able to do recently is geological sourcing. And from this stone circle at Kilmartin, we have at least 4 individual quarry sites, quite disparate from each other, which makes you immediately think, well, there must have been individual communities involved, therefore. Who were the people who were creating these places and then using them? Trying to work out how they were used is a bit of a blind alley, although lots of people have tried, and some people will have written books, sold lots of books telling you exactly how they were used, when in fact we really have no idea what they were used for, except that in general terms, we can accept that they seem to have been looking to the sky, maybe for you hesitate to use words like supernatural beings and so on, but possibly related to the movements of the sun and the moon and the stars, so sort of an interest in celestial activity and how that might have, as they believed, influenced their everyday lives. But interestingly, when you start thinking about, okay, so there's at least 4 different quarries here, different communities, maybe individual communities were responsible for creating individual parts of the stone circle. Somebody's come up with a very nice idea that each stone could even represent an ancestor, because contact with the ancestors and ongoing involvement with the dead is very much an aspect of the Neolithic in Britain. And, for instance, chamber tombs, they weren't places where you just placed corpse and left them there. There were places that were regularly, people went in and interacted with the dead, maybe priests or shaman or lords or whatever you want to call them. These words are very difficult to use for 5,000 years ago. Somebody was empowered to go in and have this contact with the dead to the extent of communicating with them, maybe even asking them questions, maybe divination, getting answers to questions about how they should be living, what they should be doing, where they should be building, or all sorts of questions like that. And lovely things like most people going to that stone circle don't realize that there is rock art, there's these spectacular spiral decorations. And the origins of these could be from great tombs in Ireland, like at Newgrange, in the valley of the Boyne River there, which introduces the issue of contact. And some of these people were very, very well travelled indeed. And there are objects and materials coming into these places from quite far distant. So it's not a case that they were isolated at all. There's a lovely tomb, much altered in the later period. You can kind of largely ignore rather fanciful reconstruction image. I mean, it's helpful to reconstruct these places in art for the benefit of visitors and to populate them with people, because they were real people who built them, who used them, who placed their family, their dead, within them communicated with the dead. But the sort of tie-dye robes and flaming torches, I'm not a great fan of that. But anyway, and obviously, if you visit these places, you can climb inside there, which is a great experience. And then at Achnabrec, just down the road, other amazing component of their ritual landscape, of their ceremonial landscape, is rock art on these sort of domed high exposures, natural rock exposures, dating from the same period as some of these tombs that we've been looking at, so say 5,000 years ago. A lot of new research been done on this, including some excavation in and around these places, which is really helping us to understand a bit more of these spirals and what are called horned spirals as well, and cut marks. And all of this is just formed by pecking away with quartz hammerstones. So that, you almost wonder in my list there of what these things were about, whether the act of creation itself, a bit like the act of creation of a stone circle, that the use of the stone circle was maybe not that important. Maybe it was the creation of it that was important, what it meant to them, what was involved, what kind of communal activity, what negotiation, what content was involved. And the fact that all of these monuments, are related to the big questions of life. Where have we come from? Where are we going? They would have had an origin myths like all traditional societies around the world have. For a good example being the Aborigines, of course, and equally another good example is the Aboriginal art as well, separated by tens of thousands of miles, separated by thousands of years. But are there helpful comparisons to be made? So you see my list there, they're in prominent places. Were they meeting places? Did initiation rites take place here? Were they marking territories, mapping the skies? I think that's an interesting idea. Is there an element of language here? Could people literally read the symbols here? I mean, these are just questions, and basically your guess is as good as mine. Little image just showing you the business of what was involved. And the quartz, by the way, the leaves marks, the quartz hammers that were used to, which is just harder, which is just a degree or so harder than the native stone itself. And so that in some light, you can actually detect traces of the quartz that were used. And there it is, is this another thing? Was it certain times of year? Here's the midwinter solstice sunset. And for about 2 hours on that day, 21st of December, assuming that the sun is shining, of course, which I'm sorry to say, in Scotland on the 21st of December is not always the case, but here it is on a lovely day, on that day, where for just a brief window, you get a spectacular illumination of the stone. So were certain times of year important in terms of what the place was used for, what it meant to them? But so much of this is lost to us. But there's plenty of opportunity for throwing ideas up in the air, and some of them are probably going to be right. And then this is a lot of fun. This is by a local artist there. This is a meteor shower in a lovely clear sky, and with the sort of effervescence of quartz remains from the quartz hammers sort of fizzing in the light, which I think is really interesting. And then these alignments, these skyward alignments, if you like, sunrise, sunset, particular times of year, equinoxes, the spring and the autumn equinox, when the day and the night are equal night equinox, lunar cycles, eclipses, calendar calculations. When you think about it with traditional societies, understanding your calendar was kind of important. The 21st of December, which is midwinter sunset, that's the dying of the sun on the shortest day. And if you'd done all the right, this is postulating, if you'd done all the right sacrifices and done all the right ceremonies and so on, and at that time, on that day, at these places, could you then ensure that from then on, the sun was going to start climbing again. The days were going to get longer. The weather was going to get a bit better. The growing season would start. And so their cycle of life could continue with some certainty. And anybody who could predict when some of these celestial events were going to take place would be a very powerful person and maybe a leader of society. So, and thanks to science, we know that on the 29th of July, 1629 BC, there was a total eclipse, which may well have been marked. This is just a bit of fun, really, but may well have been marked at some of these places. It would certainly have been a momentous event in their lives. And, eclipses to this day are pretty remarkable experiences. There's the wonderful landscape again in the autumn or winter, looking up the glen, the linear cemetery, the Bronze Age burial mounds from 1500 BC, 1000 BC, places of burial. And this, of course, is the Bronze Age where they had metal, and that transition from only having stone and bone and wood tools to metal was really obviously very, very important, but coupled with some very difficult changes in society at the time, particularly due to deteriorating climate. And this nice image that Kilmartin Museum has done of maybe the idea that at some of these times, this is maybe again in the Bronze Age, that the hillsides could be places of observation, that you weren't necessarily all participating closely in rites or rituals or ceremonies at the tombs or at the stone circles, but that you could be observing some of this and participating. And of course, people coming together. That's one of the big takeaways from this. These were dispersed farming populations, reasonably large numbers, not tiny by any means, and in the Neolithic particularly quite successful because times were a bit better and they were pretty good at exploiting the food resources that they created and that were naturally available to them. For example, red deer, big meaty protein animals, wild boar as well. Get one of those on the barbie. And so the communal aspect of this, of people coming together, people potentially coming together, it's been suggested, obviously, in Orkney, the great megalithic monuments there, Stonehenge. It's undoubted that people were coming from considerable distances from other countries as well to some of these key places. And Kilmartin is one of a handful of these prehistoric ritual ceremonial centres that we have in Scotland, which are very, very special places indeed. And people coming together would have been a big part of that. So, secondly, by complete contrast, we move out now, not that far, to Iona. A small island, it's only about a mile and a half long. The whole island in the early Christian period was the sacred monastic sanctuary. And there are various components, not just at the rebuilt monastery, at the rebuilt abbey, but various components right through the landscape of Iona, which you can visit to help understand what was going on there, particularly unpicking the more fugitive components of the early Christian landscape. So literally from the time of Columba, when he arrived in 563. And it's always fascinating, and I just cannot get over the fact that you take away the buildings there, and everything else has not changed since the day Columba arrived in 563. And he didn't create the sacred atmosphere of the place. That was already there. He just recognized it. It was probably there in prehistory, probably used in prehistory as well for that purpose. But he got it. Columba arrived, he got it. He realized something about the disposition of the landscape, of the colors, of the water, of the banding, of land and sea and land and sky and sea. The colors, you don't quite get it there, but Ben More, the hill behind there is in the Ross of Mull, is this amazing red granite, which when the sun hits it, it's absolutely spectacular. And wish away the buildings, you stand there, you are having the same view that Columba had, and no wonder he was able to create this very special place there, which then persisted through generations. And particularly thanks to his biographer, a relative called Adamnon, who wrote the life of Columba only 100 years after his death. So he kind of almost had contact with people who knew Columba. Columba was a real person. He's from Ireland, of course. He's ultimately, he'd already had quite an important, successful ecclesiastical career in Ireland before he arrived on the west coast of Scotland. As did other Irish missionaries as well in this time, in the 500s and 600s. But it's Columba who's really kind of caught our attention, particularly thanks to the biography written 100 years after his death. He died in 597. And so we have lots of information about him, including information about the place. And look at that. I mean, it's just the colours are just the white, this very, very white sand that you get, the turquoise sea. It's really, the quality of the environment is unrivaled. And there's the island. The monastery, this is looking north to south. North is nearest us, the bottom of the slide. A crofting landscape today, small-scale subsistence farming that you can see laid out there. And the monastery, the abbey on the left-hand side of the picture, halfway down the road leading down to it, and then the little just beyond that. Just an absolute gem of a place. And there he is, arriving in 563 with 12 followers, 12 disciples, of course. His whole life is kind of through the writings after his time. He is equated with Christ as many aspects of his life and his miracles, because what his biographer was really writing about were the miracles of St Columba. That's St Columba's Bay at the south end, where he arrived in his skin-covered boat. And the tour will include an exploration of various parts and various places, including the Hill of the Angels, where Columba communed with angels and received divine wisdom, and so on. Another nice view looking down from the top of Dunai, the one hill on Iona, which is not very tall, looking over to Mull and to the village of Finnefort, where you get the little ferry. There's no cars, it's great. You're not allowed to take your car onto Iona. It's fantastic. Obviously, the farmers and the local people have their cars and tractors, but by and large, you don't. And there's a lovely image of what the monastery would have looked like sometime after it had become established, but still in the early Christian period, maybe by around 800 AD, something like that. And an amazing discovery, and this is the benefit of active research. I was involved in a big project here to represent the whole site because it's in the care of Historic Scotland, although the buildings are occupied by the ecumenical Iona community, capital I, capital C, not community of the village. There's only about 150 people live on Iona. This is the Christian religious community, a dispersed community, dispersed around the world. There will be members of the Iona community in Australia, as there are elsewhere around the world. So, which helps make Iona famous around the world. There's about 100,000 people come visit every year. And one of the amazing things about current research, which I've been involved in, where that star is, it's a hillock which in Gaelic is called Tor Anaba, Hill of the Abbot. And Adamnon, in his biography, writes about Columba sitting on a writing hut on top of a little hill looking down on his monastery. And this was excavated a long time ago, but we recovered some of the wood samples recently and got them radiocarbon dated. And the radiocarbon date is of the time of Columba. I mean, this is just that was a news story that made it round the world at the time. About 5 years ago, this came out, and it was the case that Columba had his writing hut on top of that little hill, and so that he could look down and observe all the activities going on in his monastery, and people coming and going as well. When he died, he had a very plain burial, but lots of miracles, according to Adamnon, started to occur at his place of burial. So sometime afterwards, probably in the 600s, we know his bones, his relics, and the objects associated with them were removed from his grave, and a special shrine chapel was created. And this is our attempt at an image of what that shrine chapel might have looked like, based partly on. Oh, and you get this lovely effect. The St John's Cross. Their cross is standing there. This is a replica. The original is in the museum, which I'll talk about on the site. But St Martin's Cross there, which is full of complex Christian iconography, both figurative and abstract. St John's Cross has stood close to the place of his burial. The buildings, by the way, were all reconstructed in the first half of the 20th century. But on foundations, the church, for example, it's very true, but it's of the later medieval period. But you get this wonderful effect, and which was purposeful, of the cross of St. John with a lovely projection onto the face of the shrine chapel, the place of burial of Columba. And there are other components which have made it quite clear that what was happening here, and this was a place of the development of advanced theology in the Western world at the time. You know, we think of it as being a little place off an island, off an island, off an island. But it was very, very complex. And there, the street, which is called Straj na Marb, Street of the Dead, which is the processional way from the boat landing up to heading straight towards the shrine chapel of the saint, the focus of the place for hundreds of years, is clearly modelled on Roman streets. This is the street in the Forum, but also on the Via Dolorosa, the street in Jerusalem. And what the monks seem to have been doing was artificially creating a landscape which mirrored parts of the holy places in Palestine, where the monks could then, through their contemplation and through their engagement with the Gospels and other holy texts, kind of imagine themselves into that place. And this is all about an attempt at recreating a new Jerusalem in Iona to ensure their entry to heaven. And that was the old museum at the back, a sort of dusty jumble sale, which we then completely redid. And this is it, how it looks now. And it's a beautifully lit, won all sorts of awards for the lighting when we did this 12 years ago. And it's probably the project I'm most proud of. It's, I'm an archaeologist. I've been, directing excavations, digging holes in the ground, finding all sorts of amazing things over many years. But actually, the project that I'm probably most proud of is this museum, which I was responsible for the content and the context of. And we put in a lighting. The crosses were designed to different parts of them and different figurative biblical scenes to be explored by the monks at different times of day. We even have songs and psalms chanted at the time, poetry written at the time on Iona. But this is just the lighting cycle going around at different times of day, which starts at night and it goes into the early morning, the sun going around the crosses, different times of day, and just images of the museum and facsimile of the Book of Kells, probably written on Iona, the greatest gospel book of Western Europe from about 800 AD, and wonderful objects that have been found in excavations at the place. So that's me coming to the end. I hope it kind of makes sense. The simple message is that we as people, as human beings over thousands of years in the distant past and in the more recent past have altered landscapes to reflect belief systems, basically, and that you see that writ large at places like Kilmartin and Iona, and that they are wonderful places to explore. And there's me exploring it on my knees, my last gasp as a digging archaeologist. COVID saw the end to that. We were very fortunate on Iona, and it came out of all the work that went into doing the museum, actually. we were able to re-excavate some trenches from the 1960s and found a building from the 600s, which Columba's biographer Adamnon almost certainly walked through, which I think is just astonishing. And that was I was able to work with the University of Glasgow on the project there, get my knees dirty while they still worked for the last time, but that really was the last time. But what a way to go, working on a site like Iona Abbey. And there it is. Once again, you get an idea a bit more of the colour with the sun going down there. What an extraordinary sacred landscape it is. And that's the end. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. That was so fascinating. You certainly had some wonderful images there, Peter, of amazing places. Some I have been to, some I have yet to go to, but it certainly made me very keen to get there. So thank you so much. Really fascinating.
Ditto. I was just about to say the same. Thank you, Peter. That was really amazing.
We're very lucky in Scotland, you know. Sun doesn't always shine, and actually blue skies are a bit boring, but it's so rich, the heritage of Scotland. I've been very privileged in my working life to be able to have engaged with some of these places so closely, and still am participating in tours like this, and it's great for me because it gives me a focus for keeping up with the literature, keeping up with research, and there's some fantastic new work and new evidence. You know, places like Orkney, it changes almost year on year.
So Peter, when you find, as an archaeologist, you find some exciting new discovery, what happens then? How do things progress from there?
It's both incredibly rewarding and incredibly frustrating in equal measures. And unfortunately, around the world, times are tight. You know, money's very, very tight for things like archaeological work. So what little money there is has to be incredibly well targeted. And sometimes you've got no choice of the site. You're not necessarily selecting the sites. Ideally, you would like to excavate to get new knowledge. Sometimes, for example, you know, we've got an enormously long coastline in Scotland, and we're experiencing increased storminess. And you know, 100,000 miles or something, you know, all the little indentations of these kind of landscapes. It's enormously long, and coastal erosion is a problem. It's identifying sites and destroying sites. So sometimes what little money there is has to be targeted at that. There are amazing research projects go on as well. The very famous one, which I would strongly recommend anybody to have a look at, is the Nessa Brodgar project on Orkney, which has been the subject of 20 years of summer season excavations. Revolutionized our understanding of aspects of the Neolithic 5,000 years ago in Western Europe. I mean, it's as simple as that. Hugely important and incredibly rich in artifacts as well. Some of those were recently on display in the British Museum. That's how important it is. And that is a site that didn't need to be excavated. It's purely research. There was no threat to it. And consequently, it was very difficult for them to get the funding, helped by the fact it was used as training excavation. Some American university archaeology students paying each year to participate and having their most extraordinary experience. So that there are still projects like that. And that is also, Susanna gets around to what you said, what happens afterwards? Well, they found many, many large stone buildings from 5,000 years ago at that site. But while they were very, very happy, buried under the ground, as soon as you expose them, they start to deteriorate to the extent that that site cannot, even though it's amazing and big and in the heart of the World Heritage Site of Orkney, cannot be displayed because, except by something like artificial intelligence or in a remote museum or something like that, the site itself cannot be. So it's been reburied. But of course, in my lifetime, archaeological techniques have changed out of all recognition and sophistication, particularly thanks to computer processing. In another 50 years, I've every likelihood that scientific techniques, analytical techniques, will have equally moved on, and you know the site will still be there, I didn't excavate all of it by any means, possibly only 10–15% of it. So it's all of those things. It is about marshalling resources, and that was part of my job when I worked for the State Heritage Service.
Thanks, Peter. Any other questions anyone would like to ask?
I was just going to say that I've just returned from an ASA tour of Shetland and Orkney, and the last few days we're at the Nesselbrodka.
Wow. Yeah. And what was your experience, Elaine, of Orkney and the World Heritage Site?
Well, we saw everything, I think, so much. It was a bit mind-blowing.
Great.
I was interested to hear your talk, and you mentioned a few things that sort of highlighted with us looking at archaeology sites.
Yeah, well, the comparison between the amazing megalithic sites of the same date on Orkney with Kilmartin, and the fact that people from Kilmartin would have travelled, undoubtedly would have travelled and spent time at, for example, in Nesselbrodka, participating maybe in some of the big ceremonies around the amazing stone circles and on Orkney. There is a connection. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, I've got one quick one. The spirals and the other patterns, are they likely to be sort of memories of way back in the Paleolithic times with sensory deprivation inside caves and things like that, with some of the patterning that we see painted on the walls of caves?
Well, Russell, that's a really good point and very interesting. And as I said, I mean, I think it's just useful to vocalize these things and to explore them. I think they're all valid because we don't know the answer really, but by talking about these things in that sort of way, I think we can get nearer to a bit of an understanding. So certainly, landscapes of memory. Don't think we can underestimate the importance of the ancestors, real and imagined, to these traditional farming folk 5,000 years ago there in Kilmartin. And I think that's a really interesting idea. Yeah.
Well, I'd like to say a very big thanks to Peter for a fascinating talk, travelling with him through all those interesting pictures, through a truly fabulous part of the world. So interesting, so historic, so scenic. So Peter, thank you so much for giving us our lecture, and I'm sure it's made many people itching to go on your tour. There are some parts of Scotland I haven't visited before, so I'd love to go, but it sounds absolutely gorgeous. So thank you so much from all of us, all the team at ASA, for such an interesting talk. Thanks. And thank you to everyone for joining us this evening.
Bye-bye.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Lovely seeing you all. Bye.